maybe we get started. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar today on the latest news from the International AIDS Society Conference this year on HIV Science. The conference took place on the 23rd to 26th of July this year, and it's the world's most influential meeting on HIV research and its applications. And today we're joined by two fantastic speakers, Gus Cairns and Roger Pebody from aidsmap, who are going to provide an overview of the research that was presented at the conference. Please do use the Q&A function to ask any questions throughout the webinar today. We're going to take a break about halfway through to answer some questions, and then there'll also be time at the end, so please do use that function. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available to watch afterwards via the HIV Prevention England website. If you're interested in future webinars that we have coming up, please do sign up to the HIV Prevention England newsletter, which can also be done on our website. And finally, just at the end of the session today, I'm going to post a link to a SurveyMonkey, and we would very much appreciate it if you could take a few minutes just to complete that feedback survey. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Gus. Thank you very much.
Hello there. Yes, it was a conference, I think, without an overriding sort of super story, but there were certain themes that came up. And that's not the slide I was expecting. Next slide, please, Roger. Right, okay. A couple of the things that came up, we're sort of starting in the middle of things, as it were. This isn't the most sort of headline story of the whole thing, but it does exemplify a couple of the themes I think that came up, one of which was the potential and the challenges of long-acting PrEP, and the other of which was moving from antibody testing for HIV towards viral load testing, both in terms of diagnosing HIV and also towards universal viral load monitoring for treatment. Anyway, this is sort of exemplified in the concern that researchers have about whether long-acting PrEP might give rise to resistance, and specifically resistance to the integrase inhibitors, which are now the sort of top dogs among the HIV drugs, with lots of people on dolutegravir because it's such a potent and such a resistance-proof drug, but we don't want resistance to it to arise. This is a slightly misleading slide, I think. It seems to imply that using HIV drugs for PrEP is going to multiply drug resistance, in the sense that it draws this circle saying, you know, if HIV resistance arises during PrEP, then there could be more circulating resistant virus, and this in turn could endanger the effectiveness of PrEP. That's all true, but I think you have to remember that by definition, if you're using HIV drugs for PrEP, by definition, you are 99% likely not to have HIV. And you have to take drugs while having HIV, but not enough of them in order for resistance to arise. So, I mean, there is a certain amount of resistance to TDF and FTC, the oral PrEP that most people use, but whether it's enormously clinical relevant for treatment is a different question. You can construct perfectly good antiretroviral therapy regimens for a virus that's resistant to TDF and FTC. The dapivirine ring shouldn't create resistance at all, because you don't develop high enough levels of drug in your bloodstream, the systemic levels, for resistance to be a problem. But it could perhaps not work against virus that's already resistant to other drugs of the NRTI class, which the dapivirine ring is. Again, the dapivirine ring is not really an issue for UK patients anyway, as it's not licensed in Europe. But so the big issue, not a problem, is that there is a few, and they are a few, cases of breakthrough infections among people who have taken the integrase inhibitor drug cabotegravir as a long-acting version of PrEP. And if people get integrase resistance, then that could endanger their other integrase inhibitors. Next slide, Roger. No? Yes. I think I've more or less said all that already. Yeah, although the 1, 2, 3, fourth point down, long-acting PrEP suppresses viral replication, delaying seroconversion, making HIV diagnosis challenging. And that is why they're also concerned about resistance. Because, and this will be an ongoing problem, I think, for not just for long-acting PrEP, but in the future, if they develop an HIV vaccine, it could result not in a complete stoppage of infection, but a blunting of infection. So you get a much more slow, low profile, smoldering HIV infection with a very low viral load, which is very difficult to detect. And if people do have that and they're still only taking the PrEP drugs, then they could get resistance. Next slide. And this was shown in the trials we had, randomized control trials of cabotegravir as PrEP. You'll notice that only one person developed this sort of delayed seroconversion issue, and none developed resistance if they had been off PrEP for more than 6 months. But if they had been on long-acting PrEP, I should say, for less than 6 months, then the majority had this delayed seroconversion thing. The way it worked is that in the trials, people were diagnosed with fairly conventional antibody tests, but they then checked with previous blood supplies with viral load, or I should say RNA tests, to see if they'd been infected earlier. And in some cases, they found that people had been infected months earlier before antibodies showed up. So that's the issue we're dealing with. I want to emphasize again, this is a handful of people compared with the thousands that were in the study. Next slide. You don't, I mean, that's a lot of technical information about the new generation HIV tests. Basically, what we're saying is in HBTN-083, which was the study that did see the breakthrough infections in gay and bi men and trans women. Interestingly, we haven't seen any in cisgender women in the other study. Most cases could have been detected earlier with HIV RNA testing. And this segues in nicely, next slide, Roger, to another big story from the conference, and perhaps a bigger story. The day before the main conference, the WHO had a seminar which had a big splash and announced that they were sort of revising their advice on testing. And this is because they want viral load testing, and we're talking about treatment now, to be absolutely standard all over the world. And there is a really good reason for this. If you only monitor people with CD4 counts, or even worse, just by whether they're ill or not, so-called clinical monitoring, then that means that people who are on failing regimens may be on them for months and months, and they do develop resistance, and really significant resistance. And there's lots of studies from places like countries in Africa to show that people are suffering and they're losing treatment options because they are staying far too long on failing regimens. So they want to do viral load tests. The problem with viral load tests is that up to now, they've been more expensive and more technical than CD4 tests. Up till now, you've needed a fairly big sample of blood plasma, which you draw through a needle, and it needs to be kept cold and all that sort of thing. So, but there are cheaper versions of viral load testing, which have been available for some time, but are now kind of cheap enough to be able to afford to use them in low-income countries. These include what they call dried blood spot tests, which are literally little drops of blood that get stuck on a card, and you can send them off to a lab and get them analyzed. However, there is an issue with these, which is that some of the DBS tests and some of the other on-site viral load tests are not as sensitive. And so some only detect down to 1,000 copies, okay? A viral load of 1,000. And others can detect whether you have HIV down to a lower viral load, but they can't quantify it. They can't give you a figure. This presented WHO with a dilemma because although the likelihood of anybody with a viral load under 1,000 infecting someone is very low, it has happened. And they found a couple of cases where people had infected other people clearly with a viral load of around 600 to 700. So they developed this sort of three traffic light system and this new category, the amber category, of suppressed but not undetectable, meaning that we have found HIV in your system, but we can't tell you what your viral load is, which is not very helpful. We can tell you it's under 1,000, but we can't tell you what the lower limit is. So they launched this with a big hoo-ha because they really want to extend viral load testing to everybody. And I think this is a great thing and would be a huge advance in HIV treatment if they did it. But I wonder if they've jumped the gun slightly, because in a short time we will probably have cheap viral load testing that can detect down to 500 copies or something, and nobody has ever been seen to transmit with a viral load below 500. It's not an issue really in the UK, because we have conventional viral load tests, plasma-based, which can detect down to viral loads of 40, even 20 in some cases. And, once you've got a viral load like that, then there's absolutely no chance you could possibly transmit HIV. But some people have called onto this and were a little concerned about this suppressed but not undetectable category. Next slide. Yeah, this really just explains it. If you do, by the way, if you do have go to your clinic, and they will number it, but if they do have a viral load that comes along that's like kind of 500-ish or something like that, then very few people maintain viral loads of that degree. What they usually imply is that you're either on the way up, meaning that your treatment is failing for some reason. The biggest reason is difficulty in adherence, and often adherence counselling can help with that. Or it's on the way down and you have just started your therapy, but you haven't yet got completely suppressed. And this is the same advice you would give anyone in whatever country of the world. Next slide. And it's over to Roger for pregnancy and breastfeeding.
Yes, so I'm not going to be here for very long, but just this is a topic I know a bit more on. And it flows on obviously from what we've just been talking about. And this slides here are very much based on a speaker from the US who was giving a plenary and challenging a lot of the ways that breastfeeding advice is given in many parts of the high-income world in Europe, North America, Australia. Though I think she was very much coming from it from a perspective of, we've just revised our guidelines in the United States to give more options about breastfeeding, as if this was the first time that anyone had done this, whereas actually, since 2018, the British HIV Association has been quite clearly saying the safest way for a woman with HIV, if the concern is to avoid vertical transmission, formula feeding is clearly the safest way to do it. But recognizing that people make choices for all kinds of reasons, there's all kinds of factors, and therefore trying to give appropriate clinical support to parents who do want to breastfeed. Sorry. Okay. So there was a kind of review of the evidence, and particularly one of the interesting things here is about whether babies of parents who've been undetectable throughout conception and pregnancy need to take a course of medication. It's usually, I think, for about the first 4 weeks or so, which is often called neonatal post-exposure prophylaxis. The Swiss have been testing out not providing it, and their experience so far is that there's been no transmissions in that sort of situation where the parent, the mother most often, has been undetectable throughout. And this plenary was very much a call for other countries to try to extend that sort of positive message of U equals U as far as possible in this situation, but with an awareness that there are still gaps in the evidence, and that the simplicity and the clarity with which we can say U equals U for sexual transmission doesn't quite apply for breastfeeding. But I think one of the key things is the way that the UK has been going for the last few years is very much the way that a lot of other countries are going in this respect. And of course, there's still that huge difference that in countries which follow World Health Organization guidelines, WHO guidelines, it's always been breastfeeding is the main recommended thing because of all the other health risks that come about using formula feed in those kind of settings. So I think that's me. Yeah, it's back to Gus.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, long-acting antiretroviral therapy was a big thing generally at the conference. And I think this is part of a sort of a webinar that said, well, it's not going to stop here, basically. There are all sorts of other ideas that we have. Some practical, some I'm not sure how practical they are, some one-offs or things that are very close, getting ever closer, I think, to essentially some kind of vaccine. For instance, implants. We were very excited by a drug called islatravir up till last year, which could have been possibly given as an annual implant. However, it turned out to have side effects when used in the large doses you'd need for an implant. They're still being used for oral therapy and possibly weekly oral therapy. This microarray is a kind of patch you slap on your skin. It's got little fine needles that pierce the skin. You probably wouldn't feel it much, but that's been suggested. Broadly neutralizing antibodies. These are the antibodies that appear in about 15% of people with long-term HIV infection. They're sort of hypermutated ones that have the capability of getting into the sort of crevices of the HIV protein, envelope protein, and stopping it infecting people. The trouble is that they appear too late to be any use because by that time the HIV has diversified so much that it's got many viruses resistant to it. But if you could find a way of giving or generating broadly neutralizing antibodies to people either before infection or in very early infection, then you would be able to treat their infection. And you can also use them as long-acting drugs because these things have half-lives of several months, and you can inject them. The problem is that you need several because HIV quite easily becomes resistant to individual ones. I'm not going through every possibility, but I do think that in a world in which we've become used to, for instance, having a COVID booster every year or 6 months, then we might get to the stage where a long-term HIV therapy that was injected or implanted every year might not feel that different from having a vaccine, although technically it would be different. Next slide. Right. I'm only going to remark on this slide. Other than that, if you look at the small writing, it includes all sorts of drugs that I never even heard of, which is a bit of a new one for me because I'm usually fairly up to scratch on the new drugs. Certainly, I'd never heard of these two non-nucleosides, NNRTIs, and I mean, in terms of the broadly neutralizing antibodies, they all have these completely unpronounceable names. I find it easier to go by their old names, which are usually sort of strings of letters and numbers, because they're actually easier to remember. That's all I'm going to say about. Oh no, I'm going to go through a couple of them. The capsid inhibitor, lenacapavir, that is quite far along in development. In this, it has been licensed as treatment, has it not, Roger? It's been licensed in Europe. I can't remember.
Just wait for the next slide, and I'm sure that's all explained.
Okay.
Shall I give you the next slide?
Then. Oh yes, there you are. Yes, it has been approved for people with multi-drug resistant HIV, whatever that means. Lenacapavir has a lot of potential because it can be given as a subcutaneous injection, right? The previous one, cabotegravir, had to be, and rilpivirine, which has to be used in combination for treatment, is a big injection that you need a nurse to administer it. It goes into your bum, basically, usually, and it's quite a lot of fluid. Lenacapavir could be self-injected, probably, you know, in the waistline or something like that. So yeah, I think it's got a lot of potential, and there are possibly other drugs of the same sort further along as well. Lenacapavir could also very obviously be the next generation long-acting PrEP drug as well. Okay, next slide. Basically, however, the approval for long-acting drugs, even for treatment, is very patchy. The countries, or selected countries, I think it's better to say, that have approved it are in blue on the list. And that's a pretty comprehensive list, actually. I mean, the ones that have submitted but haven't yet approved are in red. But that does mean that there are a large number of countries that still haven't approved them at all, most notably lacking in places like South Asia, North Africa, places like that, lots of, quite a bit of Latin America, etc. And of course, our not so far away from home, Eastern Europe. Next slide. Now then, there is a big issue around long-acting drugs in general, but particularly around long-acting PrEP, and that is cost. And the cost is not so much that these are wildly expensive, though they are pretty expensive, but that the long-established antiretroviral therapy drugs, and particularly the ones we use for PrEP, are now cheap as chips. They're off patent. You know, you can get what used to be called Truvada for a tenner a year. It's like they are very, very cheap, and this sets up a particular challenge in many different countries in terms of the affordability of long-acting treatment and PrEP. This is a study of the rather cost effectiveness model, or a cost model, I think it is rather, of how much it would cost to bring long-acting cabotegravir to Brazil. And if the HIV prevention budget there, which is 6 million people a year, $6 million a year, sorry, did not change. And Brazil has a fast-growing HIV epidemic, but is also one of the middle-income countries which has had reasonable success in implementing PrEP. Okay. So, next slide. The issue is this: if you give even a relatively small proportion of people long-acting cabotegravir, it is so much more expensive than Truvada, than TDF, FTC, you would effectively, if you don't change your budget, be taking that money away from people who would otherwise be able to get oral PrEP. I mean, I'm not saying it's as simple as that, and I think, you know, the modeler would say, well, it's obviously not as simple as that, but it is a considerable challenge. And this is at an estimated cost of $3,500, which reflects the kind of cost that Brazil has been able to negotiate from the markets for antiretroviral therapy before. It's because it's a upper middle income country, it doesn't get the huge subsidies that places like the Southern African countries get. So 3,500 for long-acting Cairns is sort of midway between the sort of very low price they managed to negotiate for some African countries of about $250 a year, and the UK price, which is about $9,000 a year equivalent. And this wasn't the only study at the conference that showed this. There was one from Southern Africa, which I haven't shown because it's perhaps less comparable to the UK epidemic, but that also found that long-acting PrEP in particular would have to cost really not a lot more than current antiretroviral therapy regimens before it became remotely cost-effective. This is an issue for treatment, but it's much more of an issue with PrEP, where cost effectiveness is much more crucial, because by definition, with the prevention drug, you're giving that drug to people, the majority of whom would never have caught the infection in the first place. So that sort of dilutes the cost effectiveness of it. So it's a big dilemma. And I think over the next couple of years, we are going to see a lot of debate around the cost of long-acting antiretrovirals, particularly for PrEP. Next slide. Oh, Q&A.
Great, thank you very much. So do we have any questions or comments? If you do, please do pop them in the Q&A function. I'll just give a minute to see if anybody has any questions. If not, we can move on to the second half of the webinar. And of course, please do feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A function throughout the presentations as well, and we'll make sure that we find time to get to answer those.
And I'm also conscious of, because we only have an hour's webinar, there's a lot of other topics we covered, and so feel free to ask about things that we didn't cover to see if issues came up at the conference.
I'm always interested to hear what people think, you know, because we bring in examples from all around the world, and we do try to think that this is stuff that could have an implication for the UK, but you know, you guys are much more on the ground. I'd be interested to hear what you think about the kind of implications for the work that you do and the people you're serving.
Yeah, and as I think I said for the viral load testing, sometimes these are issues that really are not an issue in the UK, but people hear about them and worry about them. So, you know, they need accurate info.
Okay, so there's nothing coming in at the moment. So if we move on to the second topic of the webinar, and then if anyone does have any comments they want to put in, we can certainly come back to those. Okay. So I'll hand back to you.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to carry on the next bit. So I'm going to present a few of the more clinical things for people with HIV. And in fact, this first one, I think there was an overall theme about cardiovascular health and metabolic health. This first one is, I think, the one thing from that conference that is really going to affect care in most countries of the world. This was the session where all the doctors at the conference were packed into the same room, and it was standing room only at the back. Basically, a few years ago, a really large clinical study set up to see whether offering statins to people with HIV would have perhaps I think they weren't necessarily looking for as much impact as in HIV negative people, but would potentially have an extra benefit for people with HIV. So, the background to this is we know that people living with HIV have very high rates of cardiovascular disease. So that's heart attacks, strokes, other heart-related problems. And that's even when trying to take into account all the other risk factors that doctors already think are important. So they set up a study where they were offering to people who wouldn't know, people with HIV who were all middle-aged. I think it was the lower age limit was perhaps 45 or something. And they were all people that wouldn't normally be given a statin. So they were not people considered to be at high risk of cardiovascular disease. They weren't people who'd had a previous incident. And the particular statin they chose was one that's known to reduce cholesterol, that's LDL there, and also has an impact on inflammation. And there's a possibility that the statin does more in people with HIV because of this issue about inflammation, which is thought to contribute to the higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So it was a really large study. It was genuinely global. It was actually a kind of exemplary in the sense of recruiting a diverse range of people. It was over 7,000 people with HIV, and people were followed up for around 5 years. And the headline finding is that the rate of what they call major cardiovascular events, so there are major things like heart attacks and strokes, needing cardiac surgery, things like that, was over a third lower in the people who got the statin. The other group just got a dummy pill, so the groups were exactly the same otherwise. And then a similar analysis where you also factored in death, and that could be death from any cause. So there's a 20% lower risk with people taking the statin. And what this slide is basically saying is this is much more than the researchers expected. When they factored in what they thought would happen, just based on the impact of reducing cholesterol, they were expecting a 17% reduction in risk. And what you actually found was 35%. So there's something else going on. It's probably something to do with inflammation. And so that seems to be a benefit that is possibly there for people with HIV that is not quite the same in the general population, because there have been other studies in the general population and they haven't seen such an effect. So in terms of implications, I mean, this is obviously a big thing for, you can imagine that Beaver, NICE are going to be looking at this. And I think there's probably questions about at what age will it start to be recommended that all people with HIV consider taking a statin. There could be a thing about, even though this is people at low and moderate risk of cardiovascular disease, clearly you get more benefit if the risk is moderate or even getting towards high than if it was low to start with. So I can imagine there might be advice that would be gradual on that and probably be individualized. I don't think this is going to be a case of people being instructed to take these medications. There's issues about side effects, drug interactions. Statins are very widely used medicines, so lots of people in the general public have got their own opinions about them. And yeah, this is clearly it's a pharmaceutical intervention, and there's lots of other things you can do to reduce your cardiovascular risk. So related to that, there are a few studies on high blood pressure or hypertension. The one that I'm showing you comes from a bunch of cohorts in Europe and Australia. The other two studies were from Africa. So this is probably more relevant. And what it seems to be showing is a link between certain anti-HIV drugs and high blood pressure. Now, almost certainly part of this is to do with weight gain. So we know that these drugs, integrase inhibitors such as dolutegravir and bictegravir, and the newer version of tenofovir that's called TAF, no, they're all associated with weight gain. And just to try to talk through some of the stats on that graph, you see the top line where it says INSTI with TAF fully adjusted. So what that means is, as far as possible, statistically, they're trying to adjust that for weight gain. So that is after doing what they can to take weight gain into account. So that is, in theory, the impact of these drugs on high blood pressure, even after you've taken weight gain into account, whereas the unadjusted one is just a very simple figure without thinking about that. So it's almost certainly something to do with weight gain, but it almost doesn't quite look from that analysis like that's all of it. So I think there are still quite a few scientists scratching their heads about this, but that feels important to share. And obviously the other sort of related issue is weight gain. And this is one of two studies which, so we know already that these drugs, integrase inhibitors, as I say, the most common ones are dolutegravir and bictegravir, are quite commonly associated with people putting on weight when they start treatment. And it's possible that that is because people's health is just getting a lot better, and some of the impact of having uncontrolled HIV is being taken out. So it's very possibly more that than a direct impact of the drug as a side effect. But what people have thought is, well, okay, if it seems to happen a lot with integrase inhibitors, maybe the answer is to change drugs. So this study was a randomized study, and people had started a regimen that included both an integrase inhibitor and that more modern version of tenofovir called TAF, and had put on a fair bit of weight. Half the people were randomly allocated to change drugs, and this was to a darunavir-based regimen, if I remember rightly. And the bad news is it didn't really make a difference. And the other study was switching to a different set of drugs, the same basic message. So, I mean, I'm sure these studies will carry on for a bit longer, and maybe with larger samples. This was certainly quite a small study, but so far it doesn't look like changing the antiretrovirals is the answer to that.
Okay. Yes. Well, commenting on that, with the statin study, yeah, I think it was big news. And I got a text from my GP the other day inviting me for my annual cardiovascular health checkup, because I'm smack in the middle of the heart attack risk profile, being 67 and slightly overweight as well as positive. So I'm going to ask about pitavastatin. Anyway, the other big story, I think that got lots of news attention, was another case of apparent cure of HIV. Now we have 6 of them, but this one was very different. Since the first man to be cured of HIV, the late Timothy Ray Brown, I think his case was first announced in 2009, there has been a sort of accelerating rate of cases of cure, such that we're almost now kind of expecting one every major conference. But the way they've done these, without exception, has been that they have given bone marrow transplants, a highly expensive and risky procedure. So this is not something you would do to people unless they had cancer that needed a bone marrow transplant. But you replace the immune cells that you effectively delete in the malfunctioning immune system of the person with cancer with ones that are naturally immune to HIV. You introduce cells from people that have what is called the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, which occurs in something like 1% of people of white European ancestry and means that they are immune to HIV. Okay. That what happened to Timothy Ray Brown, the London patient, Adam Castillejo, several others. Okay. They didn't do that with this guy. He's a guy, and he did speak at the conference, but didn't wish to be named as yet. And that wasn't for lack of trying. They just couldn't find a matched donor who had the CCR5 delta 32 mutation. So he got ordinary HIV receptive cells as his brand new immune system to replace the malfunctioning one. So unexpectedly, he stayed apparently without any HIV in his system, and they eventually took him off the antiretroviral therapy, and he has stayed undetectable, and indeed they can't find any HIV ever since. Next slide. Yeah, this goes into some of the detail. Basically, the picture at the bottom shows the HIV viral load, i.e., it goes up and down and then it just flattens out. And it continues to be flat after he stopped taking antiretroviral therapy, which is the orange bar at the top. That was the last HIV drug he took, dolutegravir. He stopped that 2 years ago now and has kept a viral load undetectable ever since. The other ones show his CD4-CD8 ratio, which is an indication of general health on HIV, and his CD4 count, which is, whizzed up and down, but stayed in healthy levels. We don't know how he's managed to stay, apparently get rid of all his HIV. It may be something to do with something they call graft versus host disease, which is something that happens sometimes in transplants, where the new immune system, as it were, wins out against the old immune system. That can be very dangerous, and it's a serious condition in itself, and he had several episodes of it. But what it doesn't mean is that in the process, every single cell in his body that contained HIV may have been wiped out, which is what you want for a full HIV cure. He also took various immune suppressant drugs, including this one called Jakavi, which is not a standard drug, and that may have had something to do with him maintaining apparent cure, an apparent lack of HIV in his system. Next slide, please. The researcher, IAS Sirion from France, who essentially found this patient, was very cautious when we interviewed him, because they don't quite know how this patient has managed to apparently get rid of all his HIV, and it might be lurking around somewhere. His profile resembles a couple of people called the Boston patients, who some years back appeared to be cured of HIV with the same sort of regimen. But I think the longer lasting of the two, his HIV came rebounding back within about 9 months. So this is 2 years, considerably longer. And the other clue is that they have found HIV DNA in his body, but it's only defective. So there are other immune mechanisms that can kill off preferentially cells that have active DNA, that intact DNA that is capable of forming new HIV viruses, only leaving cells that contain the sort of junky DNA fragments of HIV DNA that can't produce virus. And as they say, HIV cannot be induced from his CD4 cells. Okay. And his HIV antibodies are gradually declining. That is rare, even in people who appear to be cured, or at least who are long-term non-progressors. It shows that there is no HIV in his system that the immune system is reacting to. Next slide. So we don't know completely why this person appeared to have been cured, or indeed partially cured himself. We may have a disappointment. There are patients who appear to have no HIV, as I said. I think one patient, they couldn't find HIV in 3 billion CD4 cells, but nonetheless, their HIV came bouncing back once they took them off therapy. You need more or less no HIV in your system to have a cure, like you need no cancer cells in your system to have a cancer cure. We shall see. If he continues to remain undetectable off ART, then we have a new kind of cure. Next slide. Ah, we are having this. I thought we hadn't. Okay, no, this is very important. Right, okay. A big story, I think, from last year generally was people who were lost to care. I first became aware of this with a UK story when it appeared at the Beaver Conference in Newcastle. In fact, in spring, sorry, it was this year. And we were told that there are now more people who have been diagnosed with HIV in the UK who have disappeared from care and don't seem to be on treatment than there are people who have not been diagnosed yet. So that's a startling statistic. And it's now becoming clear that this is a universal issue. This is a study from South Africa, where conditions are very different, I appreciate. But I think the very serious consequences of interrupting your antiretroviral therapy were really exemplified by this. Okay, so there's 12,601 people basically stopped their care out of 44,386 people. You can only get studies that big in Southern Africa, of whom 7,038 interrupted in the first 6 months of antiretroviral therapy. Next slide. So, I mean, those resuming antiretroviral therapy experience increased mortality. Within 6 months of, if they had stopped antiretroviral therapy within the first 6 months of starting it, they were twice as likely to die thereafter. And no, 283 times more likely to die. Beg your pardon. And 2.5 more times likely to die if they stopped it more than 6 months after they started. I mean, it's a really simple study. It shows the obvious, although perhaps more starkly than other studies I've seen. But the problem of how to get people to stay on their therapy is a universal one, and maybe one that you've even come across in the people you work with. So I think we will see more studies of loss to care, and also more studies talking about how to get them back into care. I think that's my bit done.
Yes. So this is the last study we're going to talk about. But I mean, I don't know, perhaps less, hopefully, well, I don't know, with sometimes the way the winds are going with the anti-trans hate in the UK, perhaps this isn't so irrelevant after all. I don't know. But from Uganda, I mean, obviously, I'm sure you've all heard in the media about the Anti-Homosexuality Act. And this was services which have been supported by PEPFAR, which is the big US government donor. And they've been actually really quite good over the last few years about supporting services that are quite geared up for members of key populations. Key populations is the sort of global health jargon for particular groups of people who are at higher risk of HIV. And obviously, men who have sex with men in most countries, including in Uganda, are a key population, and they're not the only one. And so these drop-in centres are really focused on making sure that they are quite friendly and accessible for key populations. And just the graph is showing the number of people who are attending three services in particular. and what you can see there is the drop off in these are men who have sex with men who are living with HIV or sometimes at high risk of HIV, who had basically stopped coming in to get their care, and that was even before the law was in place, while it was being debated in Parliament, while the media in Uganda was completely full of discussion of this. So there was some good news in this, in that the services actually tried to do quite a lot to adapt to this horrible situation. They were offering to do home delivery of people's medication, which wasn't always previously available. They put in extra security guards and so on, and procedures at these clinics. They would give people more months worth of drug at the one time, so they didn't need to keep on coming back. And they started offering legal support. And that graph is again just in 3 of the centres where these measures seem to have a pretty good impact. But the really depressing bit is there were 20 other centres where they at least did some of those measures, and they still didn't see that kind of recurrence. I mean, the thing I did find heartening was the American ambassador to Uganda actually came to the conference specifically to talk about that, and was quite clear in her support. But yeah, that is all for the presentations. So yeah, it'll be interesting to hear people's comments and questions.
So we've got one question in the Q&A, and then we have somebody who has raised their hand. So if we just go to the comment in the Q&A first, and then we'll come to the person with the hand raised. So Fred has asked, don't you think it would be more relevant for HIV advocates to continue to revive the primary prevention messages to stabilise HIV transmission as much as the clinical methods are still under review? So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I'm just listening to that question. I'm wondering, by primary prevention methods, is the question of thinking about condoms and so on. I don't know if the person who asked questions wants to come back in on the Q&A and clarify that. I can imagine, Gus, you've probably got some opinions on this.
Yeah, I mean, stabilize is an interesting word, because it implies that HIV is cases are going up, or at best are staying steady, but they're not. They are continuing to fall. Ever since 2019, I think, probably earlier. Cases of HIV in this country started to plummet in terms of new cases. And that's partially due to PrEP, and certainly that's played an important role. It isn't, I'm afraid, due to increased condom use, because I think now they're down to a minority of gay men even sometimes use condoms in sex surveys. And certainly condoms still have an important role to play in terms of protecting against STIs. So I wouldn't in any way advocate, against using them, no. But the most important thing is U equals U. Is that if you put people with HIV on treatment, they become non-infectious. And that has had a huge impact in a country like the UK, where the vast majority of people with HIV are now on treatment and virally controlled, and where, as we have heard just now, the big challenge is making sure that they stay virally controlled rather than that we diagnose them. So I think, I certainly think there is a very important role for condoms, but I think that the HIV is in decline, and it is due to medicines.
Thank you very much. And we have somebody with their hand raised. So Vicky, I'm going to try and turn your mic on. So you should be able to ask your question.
Looks like Vicky's still muted, I think.
While you're at it, there is also one really interesting question come up in Q&A about the South African study as well.
Oh, yes. So somebody has asked in the Q&A, I just wanted clarification on one point. You mentioned the study in South Africa regarding the prognosis after disengaging from care. Do you think this happens due to funding or stigma? Secondly, did the study show that if they go back on ARVs, they are likely to die in 6 months?
Right. No, it's funny, as I was reading that, I realized that it was ambiguous. No. It divided people into whether they stopped people in their first 6 months on antiretroviral therapy, or if they'd taken it for more than 6 months before stopping. And it found, not unexpectedly, that if you stopped early on, then you had a higher risk of subsequently dying. It's not just dying off therapy, it's any subsequent risk of death. In other words, if you stop and then restart, you still have a penalty to pay from that period of stopping, because your CD4 count will have gone down during that time. Is it stigma? Is it funding? It's complicated. In South Africa, which gets reasonable funding from PEPFAR and other global funders, I don't think it's so much funding as I think, yes, stigma still has an enormous role to play. And also just the difficulties of everyday life. You know, if you are a busy mother who is trying to hold her family together, and you're in a township somewhere near Durban and you haven't got much money, then sometimes you just can't make it to the HIV clinic, and that's why they're exploring various other methods of delivery. But I do think stigma has an enormous role to play.
Yeah, I think the complication of attending care in situations in many places, like in South Africa, where often historically the model has been people come in once a month. I mean, that's being reduced now, and I think it can frequently take the whole morning in order to get seen at a clinic. And then if you've got to add on that somebody might need an hour and a half of travel time each way, and if someone's working in the informal economic sector, that's a day they're not working. So I think that's a massive part of it.
Thank you. There's another question come in. So the webinar, your knowledge and the webinar is more focused on science and medical development, but what role do you think graphic design has to play in HIV prevention and treatment?
Well, I mean, I think this is, we should have our designer here answering this, shouldn't we, Roger?
Yeah.
But I like to think that, aidsmap is one of those people that does think that graphic design is very important at getting scientific messages across clearly. And I think, a hard to understand graphic and an easy to understand graphic, the latter is much to be preferred. And we've had examples of that in this presentation. I think slides that you had to explain and slides you didn't, because they were obvious.
But I think the other thing I would say is there was one of the studies that we thought about covering, which we didn't in the end, partly because we just couldn't fit everything in. And it was about a PrEP service in the Philippines. It was a very sort of community-led PrEP service where it was very much using mobile apps. So this organization was really good at connecting with gay men and other men who have sex with men in the Philippines, I think. And so they had really friendly apps where people were getting HIV self-tests, and then they were offering PrEP to people who tested negative in that process. I didn't look precisely at the app, but I would be very surprised if it wasn't an app that was attractive, intuitive to use, accessible. I think all those kind of like interventions, design, and I'd have to get beyond graphic design, but design is really fundamental.
Well,
thank you.
Always happens at the end of animals. I've got a couple more.
Yeah, so the next one says the BAME community we support think not hearing more of HIV awareness makes them think HIV is not infecting people. And so I think creating more awareness, as was done before, should be intensified as much as we continue with the new clinical methods as well.
I'd say absolutely. And how would you know that PrEP might be relevant for you, or getting tested might be relevant for you if you didn't already know that HIV was an issue in your community.
Yeah, I think I have a strong feeling this particularly applies to people who are not from the gay community, but maybe, Black and ethnic minority women, people like that, because we see very low rates of awareness and of PrEP uptake and of all sorts of things among Black and minority ethnic women in the UK.
Absolutely. So are there any more questions or comments to come in?
If Vicky wants to type in a question. Yeah.
And I've just popped the link to the SurveyMonkey feedback in the webinar chat as well. So if you could just take a few moments to complete that, we'd be very grateful. I'm not sure if Vicky's microphone is working, but if you wanted to pop your question in the Q&A function, please feel free to do that. Or of course, send an email to us afterwards, and we can absolutely get back to you with any questions that you might have.
From the past attendees list, I think she's gone.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that very interesting webinar and the presentations. There's a lot of information to sort of think about and reflect on there. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you to everybody who made time to come along today. We'll end there. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.